All right, we're at time. Hi everyone, I'm Vincent. I'm a software engineer who's been working in payments for a number of years and e-commerce and crowdfunding. So this is a little bit of lessons learned in kind of staying safe as an online merchant. I gave a talk last year about software engineering and payments as kind of a follow-up since there was some interest in this topic. So we're going to talk about credit cards, and I'll tell you why. We'll go over some attacks and threats, the motivation and methods behind those, and how to defend, and balancing risk at the end. So why are we talking about credit cards and debit cards in this? It's pretty much the same thing for all intents and purposes. So despite all these cool wallet methods and everything, credit and debit card combined are still the majority of online payments. So if you as an online merchant want to sell your wares, you're going to need to accept credit and debit cards. Oh yeah, like Apple Pay, Google Pay, PayPal. Yep. So even if you're using your credit card through Google Pay or Apple Pay, they'll consider that a wallet, because there's some extra protections around that, which we'll get into a little bit later. But right now we're going to talk about the credit card. You probably have a few in your pocket. The main feature of a credit card is this 16-digit number known as the PAN, or the primary account number. It's made up of a few parts. The first 6 to now 8 digits, depending on the card, is what's called the BIN, or also the IIN, issuer identification number, because the issuer is not always a bank. The first couple digits here, even like the first digit for some cards, you can determine the card type. So like 4, I believe, is always Visa, 5 is always MasterCard. Some of them you need like the first 4-ish digits should disambiguate any card in terms of the card network. And this is considered like safe information. So PCI will allow you to store this. You can look it up, so you could use bin list to look up the first 6 to 8 digits and find out all kinds of information about the card. And this is useful because the processors use this to route the card to the right network, and then the network uses it to route it to the appropriate issuer. The second set of digits is the account identifier, so that's your account with that bank. And then the final digit here doesn't even add information. It's really only 15 digits, and the last digit is derived. So there's like a little checksum, right? And that's just to prevent typos and that kind of thing. So if you had the first 15 digits of a credit card number, you could just derive the last one. Expiration date, it's not just an expiration date, it's also used to, that specific date is used to validate the card when you're using it. Card holder name, which is, believe it or not, almost never verified in any sort of way, particularly online. And the EMV chip, this is my poor ASCII representation of an EMV chip. I did my best. But this is, I think the idea of this came out in the 80s, and then they rolled it out in the 90s. But it's this little embedded computer. Believe it or not, a lot of them run Java. This, rather than just static information, there's a whole handshake that happens here. And it's more secure, it's harder to clone, all these cool things. There's also that chip. If you have a contactless payment, that same chip is at the brains, and then you have this antenna. So when you tap to pay, it's using the same chip in just a slightly different way. So there's, outside of the scope of this talk, all the cool things you can do with EMV for in-person payments, but you don't have that when you're online. Back of the card, we got the mag stripe, the signature line, which doesn't matter. The CVV, though, this is important for online payments. This is a secret code. Nobody's allowed to store it. It's supposed to authenticate you as the card holder. So all these characteristics of the card, you can't use these when you're not there. But the idea of using your card when you're not there is pretty old. So mail order and telephone, they call that MODO. Fax, that's still a thing, believe it or not. and then, the internet. That's what we're talking about today. So no EMV, no magstripe. How do you make a payment online? So, using your credit card online, you might see something like this: the name, number, expiration date, CVV, full billing address. So what do you think it actually takes to move money? It's actually usually just this, and the rest is risk-based. So just that 16-digit number, 15-digit number really, which are kind of leaked all over the place, that alone will let you move money with a few caveats. So that's what makes this thing kind of concerning as somebody accepting these. But you get all this information from the issuer. So they'll let you validate the CVV, and it's not pass-fail, it's actually more complicated than that. Address, kind of, they just pretty much validate the numbers. Cardholder name, this is very rare to ever do this, but there are services depending on the card. And then 3D Secure, which we'll get into, it's not entirely in your control as a merchant. Continuing with the overview of credit cards. So this is just kind of a diagram showing the relationship between the cardholder and the merchant, facilitated by the card brands moving money from the issuing bank to the acquiring bank. Now, information-wise, you're going to go through some processor acquirer, and based on the BIN, they're going to send that request to the appropriate card network, and then that card network is going to send the request to the appropriate issuing bank. And they all have a small role here. This is kind of the end-to-end information flow. So for example, when you provide your card number and CVV, that's going to get passed to the issuing bank, who's going to give a response. Just a little overview of credit cards so we can have a productive discussion here. So we'll go over threats. We're going to go over 3 major threats: data thieves, card testers, and fraudsters. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it's a pretty good one. We're not going to cover ATO-friendly fraud or phishing, but this will be a pretty good set of things. So the first one is data thieves. And my daughter provided this illustration here of a data thief. So they're looking to get your card details in 2 ways. One, through skimming. So like in a physical world, this would be like, this is really popular 10 plus years ago. It was like you swipe your credit card at the gas station, and there's a device in there that's skimming the card details while also letting it go through. This is important because if they're noticed and then the thing gets pulled and then the whole operation is off. So this kind of thing exists online as well. And they're also looking for card data at rest. Hopefully you're not providing this, but you'd be surprised how many folks are still logging credit card numbers or thinking that they can, obscure them in some way and, jackpot. So why, go ahead. Well, yeah, it's just because it's like a 15-digit number. So like if you hash it, it's really easy to guess it, right? So you could encrypt it, right? And like maybe rely on, really strong encryption and having the keys hidden and everything. But yeah, hashing is really not great because it's really easy to guess the number and then you have all the other information around it. Why are data thieves trying to steal credit card data? Well, they can sell it in online marketplaces to criminals who would then use it for fraud, or they can use it for fraud themselves. High-profile case of stealing card data is this 2018 British Airways hack, where 380,000 cardholder details were compromised, including CVV, right? So this is like high-quality data. And the attackers were able to get these card details through both of the means I mentioned, which is skimming, and they also found 95 days worth of transactions in unencrypted logs, so full PAN, CVV, and I think address as well. So, detection mitigation. I don't know how many of you are familiar with PCI. This is a little tongue-in-cheek, right? In that PCI is this kind of really onerous, hundreds of pages of documentation and survey to protect cardholder data, but there's so much irrelevant stuff like, oh, make sure you're running antivirus and that you have badged access to card data, that the actual like interesting technical stuff gets kind of buried, but there is some good stuff in there. So broadly, they're giving you guidance on protecting the data at rest and in transit, and that includes maintaining a secure network, and then strong access controls and monitoring. So we'll go through a bit of that, and then they can fine you for non-compliance. If you're a small shop, you can actually self-assess. They give you a little BuzzFeed quiz, and you just answer yes to everything, and you're good to go. If you're a larger merchant, you actually have somebody assess you, sometimes in person. So here's like a really naively bad example of what you shouldn't do, but this still exists in the world, right? So let's say you have some checkout page on your site, and it's unencrypted. Well, certainly anybody that could monitor the network could take the card details here. So let's say you're on a public network. Anybody along the right could grab this information. So this is like a really, really obvious one that maybe wasn't obvious in like the 90s, that you should encrypt such things. So, oh, look at that. Now it's encrypted and everything's safe, but you still have to worry about bad guys getting into your server, right? Because you're still sending this really, really volatile data to your server. So now you have this little jackpot over here. So a different way, like the modern way, you should probably think about it, is using a tokenization service. And so you'd have some client code running in a browser that would take care of the card details, and they never hit your server, right? So I hit some tokenization endpoint on my form, I get back a token, and then my server it just sends this token in the payload. So even if my server was fully compromised, it's just this little token, and I'm not storing card data. This doesn't get you out of the woods completely. Go ahead. Yeah, so like Stripe or Adyen for sure. Like the way their SDKs work, I'm not even sure. I think you can probably send them raw pans, but like they're out of any of these like kind of consumery payment platforms will provide that for you. So yeah, now you're just sending the token, but mind the front end. I didn't go into too much detail here, but let's say you're doing something like this. So this became popular, right? This is like the appropriate thing to do, but the problem is attackers understand like this is now the way, and they look at compromising the front end. So that like that British Airways attack, they found a way to compromise the front end, right? And so they intercepted the card details on the front end. There's a e-commerce thing called Magento, which is very popular. And because they got hacked so bad, the front end card attack is called the Mage card attack, named after Magento. So there's some updated guidance on this actually from PCI. This is, I don't know, in the last year or so. They realized this is a really common attack pattern now. And so things like embedding an iframe that like if the parent code gets compromised, can't tamper with. Sub-resource integrity, so like if you're including some script, you include some hash so that it can't be compromised. And they also want to monitor changes in files and things like that. Yeah. Yeah. Storing card data, this is just you don't have a good reason to do this in this day and age. If you need to like store payment methods, just use a vault. There's a bunch of them. I can't think of any reason why in the year 2025. So just don't store it. Don't log it. Don't store it. Store references to things in a vault. That's it for data thieves. And now we'll get into the more interesting part. Card testers. Another illustration by my daughter. So card testers are using you as an online merchant as a way to either test out unverified card data that was purchased in bulk, right? Maybe it's old, maybe it's cobbled together from previous breaches, but this is like this boringly commoditized criminal enterprise here, where you run a bunch of unverified card details against the naive merchant, and then you take the attested data and sell it for more. And there's even a really unsophisticated high volume attack called bin stuffing. So that's that first 6 to 8 digits on a card. Given that, guess the rest. So at high enough volume, you can find valid cards and like guess the CVV, guess the expiration date, guess the zip code. At high enough volume, this is a thing that yields results for attackers. So like I said, they can sell the data or they can use it themselves. There's these online marketplaces, from the dark web. But data quality is a major factor in price, so there's this market for cleaning card data. So again, this is very high volume to pull this off by nature. So hopefully you've monitored just like your baseline metrics here. They should be going a little wonky. There are like slow drip attacks that might be harder to detect, but like generally these are high volume attacks, so you should see some anomalous patterns. Auth rates you would expect to go down, right? Because they're testing out a bunch of bad cards. You'd expect auth rates to go down, or conversion in general. You might see anomalous traffic sources and patterns, so suddenly you're getting a bunch of attempts from a market you don't operate in. A lot of low value transactions, so to bypass a lot of risk rules, they'll usually find the lowest value transaction they can make and use that. And then the lagging indicator, the unfortunate one is chargebacks. So that's when, let's say I had my card compromised, and then later I see my statement, I go, I didn't make that charge, so I charge it back, or I report my card stolen. The money is reversed, and then me as the merchant who accepted that money, I get fined like $15 per transaction. So there's like the low hanging fruit here is like the basic stuff you do for bot protection and rate limiting. So CAPTCHA and run a CDN, all this stuff, it will absolutely not stop card testing. But what this does is it drives up the cost and lowers the volume. And then you can also use the data provided by the issuer. So like I mentioned, you can validate CVV. You can validate the address. Usually it's just the postal code or the number for the home address. You can test the name, but again, that's very rare to actually be able to get that signal. There's 3DS, which isn't like a great mitigation for this per se, but we'll talk about it. So CVV, don't ever store this. Again, this is like the secret code that authenticates you as the card holder. It's that little number at the back of your card, I think front of the card for an Amex. But this isn't actually a pass-fail thing. When you send this through, you're going to get one of these responses. Well, the processor might absorb some of this for you. But it's not pass-fail. It's kind of murky here, and then you have to make a decision what to do with this based on everything else. But you can use this as signal. AVS is a similar thing. So it's pretty common to just use zip code here, like at the gas station. That's a common thing. Just type in your zip code. A lot of online forms, if you're not being shipped something, we'll just ask for your zip code. For the street matching, it's usually they're just looking at the number for the street anyways. But again, it comes in this kind of murky response. It's not as pass-fail as you think. And then there's this 3D secure. This is really, really popular and mandated in most of the world, but not here. So this is not entirely up to the merchant. You can request an exemption, and you can say, I've run all these checks. Please don't prompt for 3DS because it's a bad experience. And then you can also say, like, this looks kind of suspicious. I want you to do a 3DS check. But it's ultimately up to the issuer to do this. And it's kind of this MFA for your credit card. Has anybody experienced this? Like 2 hands out of the whole room? It's very rare, right? Much more popular in Europe. And there's 3DS 2, Which is the same thing, it's lower friction. I think 3DS1 was really, really clunky. 3DS2 has like lower friction flows, and they even have like a invisible reCAPTCHA kind of thing where the issuer does a bunch of fanciness on their side and makes a decision. But for the most part, it's kind of this MFA thing that is really annoying if you get to it, but obviously is a pretty good deterrent for bad actors. For card testers, don't be a cheap oracle, right? They're running a bunch of card details against you to see what's good. Try not to be too helpful with your error messages, like the CV is incorrect. Okay, cool, I just need to change that and then run it again, right? So this is why you'll get kind of not very helpful error messages on a lot of sites when your card details are wrong. And it can be kind of frustrating, but this is why. If you're too helpful, you're a cheap oracle for the criminals. There's other step-ups, right? So you could have an annoying 3DS MFA prompt. You could be really heavy-handed and say, oh, we want to do a liveness check and hold up your ID, but there's trade-offs, right? That adds friction. So last we'll talk about fraudsters, the final illustration provided by my daughter. So this is where criminals use stolen credit card details to purchase things that they can then resell, like expensive electronics, or directly extract money through self-payment, purchasing gift cards. If it's a marketplace, they can buy stuff from themselves. So this is a big problem, billions of dollars, card not present fraud in the US alone. And really, US is kind of in the worst spot here because of we don't enforce 3DS and all these other things. So the percentage of fraud is also mostly card not present these days, because card present, you've got the chip and you've got all these other things, whereas online we're lagging quite a bit. Detection, this is harder, right? So on the card testing attacks, they're really high volume. We've now distilled these high volume things into a set of very, like what goes for a lot of money, tested, verified card details. So it's gonna get kind of lost in the noise if you have otherwise high volume. Auth rates and conversion hits maybe, because again, they're now hitting you with what's verified card details, so they're gonna have a pretty good success rate. And then of course, you still have chargebacks to worry about, and that's usually gonna be for much higher dollar amounts, right? They've gone through the pain of verifying this card details, they paid good money for it, so these chargebacks are gonna hit a little harder. So unfortunately in the US, almost all the liability is on the merchant for you to make this decision. Like I mentioned before, you have CVV, AVS, 3DS. These are things you can check against the issuer to make a decision here. If you're an online merchant shipping goods, you can match the address. That's like a reasonable thing to do. Keep in mind, criminals know how this works, and they'll often match the address and then change the shipping address with the FedEx or UPS, for example. There's tools from vendors. You can make your own in-house rules based on what you know about your business. But unfortunately, this comes to you as the merchant, and this isn't like an ethical choice. Do I accept this money or deny this money if it's fraudulent? Because you don't know, and the risk is on you. So if you accept money that turns out to be fraud, you are fully liable for that. You'll lose the money in chargebacks and fees. And so this is kind of a nuanced thing where the ideal system would block 100% bad of traffic and convert 100% of good customers. It's like the mystical WAF that was supposed to solve all our problems. This doesn't exist. So it comes down to balancing risk and what you know about your business. So there's not really any silver bullets, unfortunately. You just have to pull in different signals and make good decisions. There's a lot of vendors for this. Usually, Stripe and Adyen have their own solutions as well. So like Revenue Protect and Radar. So you can use these tools that'll pull in all these different signals and make good decisions. But unfortunately, again, it's on you as the merchant for the most part to make the right decision here. I said I wasn't going to talk about phishing, but I thought this was relevant. This was a Krebs article that came out a couple weeks ago. So, you know, if you're taking credit cards online, it's kind of risky because of all the things I mentioned, right? It's just that PAN, which is kind of easy to obtain. Wallet transactions are much lower risk, but they are not without risk because there's this whole article on how folks are getting phished into giving up their card details and then answering a prompt where the criminals will then add the credit card to a wallet. And so now these wallet transactions have your stolen credit card on them. And merchants are seeing this and saying, oh, cool, it's a wallet transaction. This is really low risk. So this is a whole criminal enterprise you can read about here. I'll link you to the slides. That's it. So more secure methods are available, like wallets, but they're imperfect and adoption is very slow. Credit cards and debit cards are still the bulk of online transactions. In the US, at least, risk is almost entirely on the merchant, so it's up to you to make good decisions here. Be smart about protecting cardholder data. Don't store what you don't need. Hopefully, you know, understanding the value you provide to attackers and understanding this thing that's going on helps you make better decisions to protect yourself. And yeah, don't be an easy or cheap target. There's like really sophisticated methods here, but like I said, the basic stuff, bot protection and rate limiting is gonna save you a lot. So that's the end of the content. Thank you.
Hi, I'm curious, why doesn't US adopt more 3DS verification system then?
I don't know why it's gone that way, but in Europe, it's like the government regulation is what's pushing this down. In the US, it's been like the card networks protecting themselves, so it's just been different. So like you can, as the merchant, do this liability shift where you say, issuer, I want you to do 3DS, and if this is fraudulent, you take full responsibility for it. Whereas, so you have that lever, but in Europe, for whatever reason, the European government has done this to protect consumers versus here, that has not happened.
I've noticed when you buy like low budget airline from Asia, they use that system also. So it's more prevalent in Europe, but not just in Europe. I have a follow-up question. Why is it that sometimes when you use a card online, like the Visa, Chase Visa doesn't work? And from my experience, my Amex almost always works in these cases. Is there, like, what is the difference? Obviously, different banks and different networks, but do they implement these things differently?
Why would a Visa not work with Amex? I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, there could be different reasons for that. There are different card networks for like international purchases in particular. Or? Yeah, I'm not sure.
Hi, thanks, great talk.
Thank you.
If you're a small merchant, does Stripe or PayPal take the risk for it because they're the ones that are submitting the transaction?
Kind of. Usually not, though. So like my wife runs an online shop, and I was surprised to learn that even though she's on this like e-commerce platform, she's still liable for chargebacks. So it depends. Like for the most part, no. Like it's still you on the merchant. If somebody uses a fraudulent payment, that's on you. You usually eat that cost.
Okay, thank you.
But there are cases when you can again like do some liability shift.
Do you know because you said that the best way to do it is just to not store the card details at all. So for things like subscription services, streaming, or like Amazon, if they deliver something regularly, are they just storing your card details in the way that you said not to, or do they have a vault or some other kind of system where they can do that?
Yeah, I mean, if they're passing PCI audits, they're probably not going through the trouble of storing it themselves. They're using some vendor. But I mean, someone as big as Amazon probably does in a secure way. I'm not quite sure, but yeah, these much larger vendors might find it advantageous to do themselves. Otherwise, yeah, they'll use Braintree, or like you can store your cards on Stripe or Adyen, right? And you get that token back, and all you're storing is that token and some reference to it.
Thank you.
Hi. So recently, I conducted a pen test in which, can you hear me okay? I enumerated upwards of probably 50,000 credit card transaction logs. They were using a payment provider, but they were also using, they stored the masked credit card number, but they didn't mask the first 6 to 8 along with the CVV full name, address. When I approach, I'm getting pushback on the, oh, we're masking it. How can I better illustrate the risk there of, just because it's masked, since you're including all of this other crucial data, how can I illustrate that risk in an effective way?
Yeah, I mean, you can point them to card testers. Like that data would be really valuable to card testers, where they just guess what's in between, and then do you want to be the one that provided them that? Yeah, I guess that would be a good way to illustrate it. Guess those numbers in between, because if it's like first 6 plus last 4, then you just fill in the blanks. At high enough volume, you could certainly do that.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah. And if it's like CVV as well, like they're not ever supposed to log that. So.
Okay, and is there any standards besides PCI DSS I can kind of point to cite, or any studies or?
Standards-wise, no. And again, PCI is really just about protecting cardholder data. They're not going to help you with preventing fraud or anything like that. So yeah, I'm not sure about any set of standards per se. You could look at like kind of the regulatory pressure in Europe as like a way of protecting cardholders on these other things, right? Yeah, I'm not sure of another set of standards per se.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So particularly for that first threat on data thieves, just good cybersecurity practices. Look at OWASP, there's a good set of standards to concern yourself with.
First thing first, thanks for the talk. My question is there any specific SDKs which includes built-in security controls for those who is developing or handling the backends of the payment gateways? The reason why I'm asking, because I am working as a penetration tester, and there are a lot of findings we are still found during the penetration testing engagements. Yes, they just start to cross-check the amount should be greater than 0, but it's still, there are many attack vectors. For example, I can still order, for example, iPhones by changing the amount, changing the currency to, let's say, the Cameroon currency. Instead of paying $1,000, I just pay a few bucks, and my order successfully handled by the payment gateways. So
Yeah.
I always looking from the attacker sides, but I'm just wondering, is there any specific or universal SDKs you can implement through in general in banking industry or the payment gateways?
I don't think there's any universal SDKs. Maybe there's an open source opportunity there. But there are like reasonable things from vendors, right? So the pen test you're doing is probably somebody who's being clever and rolling their own, and it's decades old, right? But the good news is like a lot of the off-the-shelf stuff, like from Stripe and Adyen and Braintree, are gonna like be pretty good at giving the tools to mitigate a lot of this stuff if you know how to use them. But yeah, I don't know of anything universal. So maybe maybe somebody wants to open source something. It'd be a good project.
Thank you.
Appreciate the talk. I've always been wary of, as a developer, wary of actually going into e-commerce sites, like taking on customers and opening myself up to a risk because of my not understanding things. I've always been paranoid of the vaults as well because it's a central point of attack. But it's verified by Visa. I've been seeing that a lot, where they offload you to the Visa site, and they're the ones verifying your information. Is that one of the tokenization methods?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with that one, but that's probably an example of one of those liability shifts.
Uh-huh.
That's probably like 3DS2 or something. That's more like akin to wallet. That's specific to Visa. I'm not too familiar with that one, but I would say that's probably one of these examples of like, if you adopt this thing for that transaction, they'll indemnify you.
The other one is more of an observation. Is that what I'm noticing now is that if I've got subscriptions, and I change my card, they automatically charge the new card, and I'm kind of interested in what's going on.
Card
and what they actually
updater
keep.
service.
Yeah. So, but that might be a topic.
Yeah, the card updater service is really interesting, right? And it goes back to this like balance/arms race thing. So you want to like keep customers happy, and you also want to not enable fraudsters. So yeah, it happened to me recently. Like I had a card I never even swiped. I'm not sure how it got compromised, but card got stolen. I replaced it, and I was like, oh boy, I'm gonna have to go update a bunch of subscriptions, right? Like some of them maybe they have auto update, or some of them don't. And like I think 99% of it just auto updated because it's really common now. So like these card vaults are smart, right? They're not just storing this raw data. They usually have some integration with the networks. And so this is a service where, you know, a merchant with good reputation will, you know, subscribe to one of these card updater services. So when a customer's card gets compromised, they'll just update it, which is, you know, I think helpful in a lot of circumstances and also creepy in others. But there's also a more nefarious thing where if a bad actor gets your card attached to one of these things, now it's really, really hard to get out, right? So like adding it to a wallet, for example, that's going to be really, really hard to dispute. And like it's possible, yeah, and once you get that stickiness of the card updater, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I wish there was some way to like opt out of it. It's definitely got the creepy factor too.
Hi, one more over here. Thank you for your talk. It's, first time at SCaLE, and I learned a lot. I was just wanted to ask about that trick where fraudsters can change the shipping address through the shipping vendor. That's happened to me a couple times where I have to go to a FedEx in like Hollywood or something for some reason. And I was wondering if you could expand a little on how that actually works and if there's like defense you can do as a merchant or as a customer.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've worked in e-commerce where you're shipping stuff, but I know this still happens. And if I remember correctly, we had to tell FedEx and UPS not to allow that to happen. And I don't remember exactly how we did that, but that's a thing, right? So I don't know if you can do that on an account basis or a transaction basis, but usually there's some way to say, don't allow the customer to change it. Because otherwise, like given a tracking number and some other information, they call up, do a little social engineering, and they say, oh, I need to update my address, and they reroute it, which is kind of absurd. There's also, I mean, I knew of cases where folks would just physically intercept. So like they'd be near wherever the compromised card was from, and they'd intercept it.
Thank you for this talk. Firstly, it was excellent. I had a question for you. In a scenario where two different people asked you to give them advice for selling stuff online, the first would be, say, your grandmother who's not tech savvy, who wants to sell knitted sweaters or something. What would you tell her? And then maybe your best friend who's super tech savvy wants to sell, I don't know, rebranded Raspberry Pis or something as an example. Would you tell them to do two different things or the same thing? Or what would you tell them?
Yeah, so the less tech-savvy person, you'd want like the most consumer-friendly marketplace. Like, don't spin up your own website, for example. And so, I don't know if you're on some online marketplace, I don't want to like name drop, but a lot of them, you know, these two-sided marketplaces, they'll absorb a lot of that risk. But as soon as you have like your own shop and you're kind of considered the merchant, even if you're on one of these platforms that provide such things, you absorb a lot of the risk. So yeah, I would say if you're a little tech savvy, do something where like you are more directly represented as the merchant. Less tech savvy, just use kind of one of these broad consumer marketplaces.
So I'm kind of curious about your perspective on using the almost like burner cards that you can use on a per vendor basis, like what privacy.com does, where you're able to send up a card for a merchant or a specific category, lock it, set the actual funding amount to it, and control it. And if you find that it's been compromised, you just burn it, just re-roll a new one.
So yeah, again, this was like from the perspective of a merchant and the risk you take. As a card holder, there's a ton of things you could do. So like definitely a big fan of those, like, you provision this temporary card number and set it for a certain amount. Like broadly speaking though, all the liability is on the merchant, so use the card holder. One thing I would say to do, like as a card holder, don't ever use your debit card. Just use a credit card and pay it off, because the card networks are pushing all the liability onto the merchant. So that's bad news for the merchant. Good news for you as a card holder. Like, if your card gets compromised, you don't have any risk. Well, it's very low. I won't say you don't have any risk, because there are these like edge cases of liability shifts. But for the most part, like there's a lot of protections on card holders, and there's a few services I think that'll let you like generate a temporary card number. I think that's great. That doesn't really do anything for the merchant. Unless everybody used these things, if everybody used these things, there'd be nothing to compromise, right? And then you wouldn't be getting hit by carding attacks and fraud.
You mentioned that wallets like Google Pay and Apple Wallet are much more secure. How as a merchant or would you go about implementing that? What's the best approach?
Yeah, I mean, so you need to be working with a processor that accepts them. Rarely are you going to have to like implement it from scratch, but most of the modern processors will have those as payment methods you can accept. And so they're really clever. I mean, it's kind of an evolution of what we learned from EMV, where there's this kind of cryptographic exchange, and the number that is generated from these transactions is useless. It looks exactly like a credit card number. It's a 16-digit PAN for all intents and purposes, but it's useless without the cryptographic signature. So it can get leaked 10 ways from Sunday. It's the same. So similar to when you use in-person payments with Google Pay or Apple Pay, which I highly recommend you do. That if somebody were to intercept that DPAN on the device, it's useless to them.
Have you met the other side in person and talked to them?
Have I met the other side, the cyber criminals?
Yeah, the cyber criminals, yeah.
I mean, maybe without knowing, yeah.
I noticed that you attended DEF CON. Are they there?
Is this my time to plug the Payment Village at DEF CON? Well, we're not a group of criminals at the Payment Village, though, but like this is where educating professionals on like what's going on in the criminal world. So, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Any more questions? All right, thanks very much. If you want to reach me, here's my info, and then I have a bunch of stickers up here, including Payment Village stickers. So feel free to grab some.
Okay, can y'all hear me? Yes. It is 1:45, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Y'all made it. This is the last talk before the keynote, so I appreciate that y'all are here on a Sunday afternoon with me. So today I'm gonna talk about defense in depth as learned from watching football. And now, spoiler alert, I have watched a lot of football. So, I am Kennedy Toomey. I'm an application security researcher and advocate at Datadog. And previously, I was a senior application security engineer at an app development company. And then before that, I had a brief stint as a software engineer. And now, something a little more important than that, I'm a football enthusiast. And I'm gonna give y'all a little fun fact. When I was in elementary school, I wanted to be a quarterback in the NFL. No joke, you can ask my parents, specifically though, for the Baltimore Ravens. I'm from Baltimore, how could I not want to be a quarterback for my home team? As y'all can see, I did not make it to the NFL. That's probably because I never actually played football, besides in the neighborhood growing up. But we're gonna talk a bit about defense in depth today and what it is and how on earth it relates to football. So defense in depth is the idea that if you have one control and it fails, and you're in trouble. But if you have multiple controls, or if you have at least two and one fails, you're still okay. So let's think about as you're driving a car. You should be wearing a seatbelt. Your car has airbags. There are crumple zones of cars. There's anti-lock braking, and then a lot of newer cars even have lane departure warnings. Now you might say, okay, we're not talking about cars today. You're right, but this is what I'm gonna call safety in depth. It's all of these different safety measures put in place to try to minimize harm to the people inside the vehicle in case of a crash. And that's exactly what security is. We are trying to minimize the impact of anything happening. So again, I'm calling this car example safety in depth, but we're gonna focus on defense in depth, which is the same premise. So now, why football? Now, do we have any football fans in the audience? Okay, that's good to know. So often, security is scary. It's gate-kept, it's not often accessible, and my hope is to change that, especially by relating security to a popular sport, a popular pastime, and I hope that it becomes more relatable. And just in general, I tend to relate a lot back to football. And now I do want to clarify, we're talking about American football, not soccer. So do we have any soccer fans in this space? Okay, great. I also like to watch soccer, not as much as football, but if you're a soccer fan, you might just need to use your imagination. So let's do some quick football basics, because I understand not everyone knows football. So we've got an offense. These are the people who are trying to score. Then we've got the defense. These are the people trying to stop the offense from scoring. Pretty much, it's as simple as that, and that's all you need to know right now. And I do want to point out that today we're thinking about defense in depth and security from an application security mindset. So, do we have any developers here? I'm assuming yes, most of y'all are developers. That's why we're here, obviously, we're at SCaLE. But this is focused for y'all, and especially how to keep a web application secure by adding multiple layers. And now, if you are interested in other areas of security, you can easily take this and adapt it to other areas. And my goal here today is that you walk away with a better understanding of AppSec methods and concepts. So let's go into the coaching staff, which I'm calling here the security team. And now, in some situations, you might be the entire security team. You might be working on an open source project, or you're working at a startup or a small company, and you might be the only person on the team. There are also some coaching staffs that just have one coach. Think, 5-year-olds playing soccer, they might have one coach. But sometimes, like in the NFL, they have so many coaches with each have different responsibilities. So you might not always have a full team behind you, but sometimes you might. And sometimes you might have a team of hundreds who all have different areas of expertise. So let's talk about the head coach. The head coach sets the overall game strategy. This is the person who's in charge. And guess what? So is the CISO. They set the overall security strategy. And now with both, they have the same responsibility. They are leading their team, and they are making the important decisions. And now, if you think about it, both of these roles are often paid the big bucks. But they have the most risk placed on them. I don't know how often y'all hear about different football head coaches that are fired because their teams are just not performing the way they should. They have the most risk on them because all the decisions eventually fall back to them. But with both of these roles, they have trusted advisors who help guide them to make good decisions. So in football, we have a defensive coordinator. And if y'all want to try to guess what the defensive coordinator does, they lead and design the defensive strategy. Now, if y'all want to make it even more simple, they coordinate the defense. But essentially, they design the defensive plays. They are the defensive masterminds. And with this, we've got security architects and engineers who also kind of are the masterminds of everything in the security world. So they implement and design the security strategy. And with that, they also create and implement a lot of the security controls that we're talking about. And even with these roles, they have more trusted advisors who are even more specialized. So let's talk about position coaches. And you might be familiar with this, you might not. But they provide expertise on a specialized group. And with that, they help develop that specific type of skill. So a quarterback coach. And now, let's just think about this a little more broadly. Imagine that we have a kicking coach who helps the people who are kicking on the football team. They probably can't help the quarterbacks too much because they're focused on kicking. Just like the quarterback coach who teaches people how to throw probably can't help the kickers as much. And so we've got these position coaches in football. But then, what do we have in security? We have subject matter experts. These are people who have a specific focus in security. And now, whether it's on the OWASP Top 10, or whether it's a specific like Azure AD focus, it all depends on the person, but they provide that expertise on that specialized topic. And they use that to help advise, and they help move the security strategy. So now, let's take a step back. We're kind of done talking about coaches. Let's take a step behind the scenes, because not everything happens during the game on Sunday. Football teams have a playbook. And in this, it's a collection of plays that could be run. But we also have an incident response playbook in security, which, if y'all want to try to guess what it is, it's a set of procedures for responding to security incidents. They're pretty similar, they're called the same thing, and they have the same goal. They're both outlining ways to stop the opposition, whether it's an attacker or the offense. And now, I don't expect y'all to be able to understand either of these. But I thought it was really nice to be able to visualize both types of playbooks next to each other. And I will call out the security playbook is straight from CISA. If you're unfamiliar, it's a government agency that focuses on cybersecurity and infrastructure. And then the last thing in this kind of behind the scenes side that we're talking about is watching film. And I don't know how many of y'all played sports growing up, but a lot of times, players and coaches, they will watch film, they'll watch previous games. They will watch both how they are doing in previous games and how the opposition is doing in previous games to help identify the weak spots in both the opposing offense, but in also their defense. And they do this to create a plan to address those weaknesses, which, if we think about it, that's exactly what threat modeling is in the world of security. Our goal is to identify the weak spots in the application and in the security strategy in order to implement a plan to address those weaknesses. So now, we're going to take a look at the offense. And you might say, but Kennedy, we're here to talk about defense. Why do we need to know the offense? Because we need to understand what we're up against, which is the attack. And I promise this is short. We've got our quarterback. And now, if you're not familiar with football, this is the person who's normally throwing the ball. But they essentially organize and run each play. They tell everyone else on the field what they're going to do. And now if you want to guess, this is just like our threat actor. They are organizing and running attacks. So our quarterback could be our threat actor. And since all plays go through the quarterback, all plays go through our threat actor. But now we have our receivers and running backs. And our receivers are the ones who normally catch the ball, and the running backs are normally the ones who run with the ball. And their goal is trying to find holes in the defense. They are trying to score. And we can think about this in terms of tools and scripts, and how are these threat actors, how are these attackers trying to gain information? They're using tools and scripts. And so they're using vulnerabilities in a system to gain access. Okay, I told you we weren't talking about the offense too much. So now let's talk about the defense, which is why we're here today. This is the security measures that are in place. And now there are 3 layers to a football defense. First, we've got the defensive line. These are normally the biggest guys, and these are normally the players who are right up against the offense, the people closest to where the offense is. And they are the first line of defense. Okay, kind of makes sense, the defensive line, first line of defense. But then we have the linebackers. And these players, they're in the middle. They are the middle protection. And then lastly, we have the secondary, which they are the last line of defense. They're kind of like the, oh crap, we need you right now. So, again, this is back. I do not expect y'all to be able to understand any of this, but I promise it's coming back again for visualization help. So let's talk more about the defensive line, which again, the first point of defense. So I told you it would be back. We've got our defensive line players, and as you can see, defense, they're the blue dots, and if you can see, the red dots are the offense. These players are the closest to the offense. They are right there at the beginning. And they're actually trying to go towards the offense, which is unlike some of the other positions. They're going forward. And as you can see, and as you may know, the NFL, the NCAA, they have some wonderful copyright laws, and I was not trying to go against those. So we are highlighting some high school football pictures that were all available that I could use. So you probably don't recognize these players because I've got no clue who they are. But I can tell you this is probably the defensive lineman who has his arm raised, trying to swat down or block the ball that the quarterback is trying to throw. But I digress. So let's start off with talking about our defensive tackles. And their role is to stop plays early. Simple as that. And they do this in a few different ways, but they're trying to pressure the quarterback and disrupt run plays. They are trying to essentially do what they can so that the play can't even start. And now we are in LA, so I can't not bring up Aaron Donald, who I know recently retired, but is a great defensive tackle, who was on the Rams for years, won a Super Bowl with y'all. So wanted to call him out here. But now if we think about it, do we know any security tools that help find vulnerabilities early? We've got some static application security testing scans, or otherwise known as SAST. These tools find code vulnerabilities early. These are great as you're just starting out on a new project, just starting out to write code. These help find vulnerabilities at the beginning. And specifically because it's looking at the source code. It does not need a running application at this point. It is looking at your static source code. And these scans are great. They're looking for patterns, essentially, in your code, but patterns that have led to vulnerabilities in the past. So you'll normally see cross-site scripting or SQL injection being alerted here. A lot that we can find in the code. But I will say, SAS scans have a good bit of false positives because they're pattern matching. They have no runtime context with this. So we'll touch on that a bit later. So now let's talk about our defensive ends. And they are protecting the edges. So our defensive tackles, they were in the middle. Our defensive ends are on either side of them. And they're also trying to do the same thing as our defensive tackles. They're trying to pressure the quarterback and disrupt our run plays. And from there, I don't know if y'all are familiar with this person, J.J. Watt is a great example of a defensive end. If y'all don't watch football, he was in a truck commercial recently. He also now owns a soccer team. So he's definitely getting into some more things other than football. But again, let's focus on security. We've got interactive application security testing, or IAST scans. And now these are very similar to SAST as they're trying to find code vulnerabilities. What differs here is we're trying to find them at runtime with IAST scans. So we're able to use the context of the running application to do the same thing that SAST scans are trying to do, find vulnerabilities in the source code. So runtime versus static. And with these tools, they tend to reduce the amount of false positives, which, if you've ever had to deal with false positives, generally people don't like them. And I'll be honest, as a security person, I don't like false positives either. Not only because I then have to spend time going down the rabbit hole, but I also know that the more false positives I work with developers to fix, the less likely they're going to want to fix things in the future because they just wasted their time fixing a false positive. So generally I like IAST scans because they have less false positives due to the runtime context. And with this, you do need to have something running. So these normally happen a little later in the software development lifecycle, or the SDLC. And now let's talk about our nose tackle. And as I've said, the defensive line, these are the biggest players on the field. Our nose tackle specifically, usually the biggest. And they're specialized. They are the people right up against the offense, but specifically in the very middle. And so they are, again, trying to stop plays early. But with that, they're trying to pressure the quarterback and disrupt run plays. Okay, all sounding similar, right? Well, I will give you a quick example. Vince Wilfork, if you're not familiar with him, he was on the Patriots, dynasties specifically, when they won multiple Super Bowls from 2004 to 2014. But also, if you're not a football fan, he was in a commercial last year where he was grilling. And you might say, grilling, okay. He was welcoming Jason Kelsey into retirement and teaching him how to relax. And I'm sorry, it's a talk about football. The Kelseys are everywhere these days. I felt like I had to sneak one in. But no, that's how you might recognize him if you're not a football fan. But, you know, I know we're kind of abstracting things, but what kind of abstractly is a specialized tool that stops vulnerabilities early? We've got our static composition analysis scans, or SCA scans. And now these are finding vulnerabilities in your third-party libraries. And with that, we want to identify vulnerable dependencies by version. And now, if you've ever worked with a project that has multiple dependencies, you know they either often get updated with security fixes, or they never get updated with security fixes. And the challenge with this is about 70% of code is made up of these third-party dependencies. So with that, about 70% of the vulnerabilities I see come from third-party dependencies. And with that, you don't have to be making changes to your code for vulnerabilities in your dependencies to show up, because it's not your code that's wrong. It's something that went wrong in the dependency. So we want to make sure that we use these scans throughout the life cycle. We want these at the very beginning during development, using IDE scans or CLI scans. We want these in the pipeline. We want PR checks on this. We want to make sure we have production scanning with these scans. So now let's move on and talk about the linebacker, which this is the middle protection. And specifically today, we'll focus on two types of linebackers. But we will just go into the same graphic again, and we can start to see we're moving to the middle of the field. And we also have two different colors that we're looking at. We've got some pinkish purple ovals, and we've also got some yellow ovals here. And these are our linebackers. So we've got the outside linebackers. And if you think back to the image I just showed you, these are the pink and purple ovals that we are seeing. And they are protecting the gaps missed by the defensive line. And now those could have been purposeful gaps, or they could have been accidental gaps. And with that, they have similar responsibilities. They still want to pressure the quarterback, but they're also trying to cover the edges. And with that, Clay Matthews is a great example. If you're not familiar, he was with Green Bay for a while. I think he even ended his career in LA, but had long blonde hair, was in the Aaron Rodgers era of Green Bay. But with that, we've got some dynamic application security testing. And I promise this is the last AST acronym, but there will be more acronyms because it's security and security likes acronyms. But with this, it's an automated attack against the running application. And so the goal is to find runtime vulnerabilities. But it does this by simulating easily automated attacks. And these scans are really good at catching cross-site scripting, missing headers, different things of that nature. But there are drawbacks, which specifically is it doesn't always have the context. And these attacks that it's running, they're not tailored for the specific application. They are generic tests that can be run across multiple applications. So with that, we'll move on to inside linebackers. And their role, again, probably pretty similar, protect the gaps missed by the defensive line. And with that, because they're in the middle of the field, they're trying to stop the run plays and any short pass plays that happen. But I'm gonna be honest, these inside linebackers, they're normally the masterminds of the defense. These are normally the players who have such a high football IQ. They are the ones who are really trying to coordinate everyone. With that, did I mention I'm from Baltimore? Ray Lewis is one of the all-time greats from Baltimore, won 2 Super Bowls with us. Truly a football mastermind. Again, the IQ for football was off the charts, and it was so fun to watch him play. But then, okay, let's think about security. Who's the mastermind? We've got our pen testers or penetration testers. And if you're not familiar with this, they are highly specialized people who are essentially trying to attack your application. And you actually pay them to try to attack your application. And so they're running custom attacks at runtime. But the key word here is custom. They can do whatever they want, essentially, because they're a human. They're not automated. Now, they can run automated attacks that they've created or that they have at their disposal. However, they've got a brain. They can think through things. They're able to connect different pieces together. And so with this, they are trying to manually find vulnerabilities that are specifically custom and complex. These might not be your normal everyday vulnerabilities. These might be some really interesting ones. And with that, they're also trying to cover the gaps that some automated tools may miss. And now here, I will call out, pen testing is expensive. It's expensive and it takes a long time. So not everyone and not every company and not every website or web app is able to have a pen test done all the time. So with this, that's why we do also have DAS scans. Even if they have some drawbacks, they're nice to work together. So when we can't always have a pen test done, we have some protection in place still. However, there are some good cases for a pen test, whether you're releasing a new feature that specifically has a lot of security value. Think you're creating a new auth page, or you're going to be dealing with PII or PCI. Those are some pretty good cases to have a pen test done, but also if you're getting ready for a big release, and if you are trying to put some code into production where you have nothing in production now, might be worth a pen test. So with that, we'll move on. And this is our last line of defense. These are our last people who can try to help, or tools that can try to help. So here again, we can see that these are the last people. They're the furthest from the offense. And so now we have this wonderful picture. And as you can see, we've got our offensive player in navy and yellow, and he's already caught the ball. He's already running downfield. But we've got our member of the secondary, our defensive player in white and orange, still trying to tackle him. Because guess what? It's not over yet. It's not over till the player scores. There's still an opportunity to mitigate the risk. And that's very true for football, but also security. So we do have a cornerback, and I'm going to be honest, sounds like a quarterback, not the same thing, pretty different. But with that, they cover the short and intermediate areas of the back of the field. And they're trying to stop any breakthrough runs or any intermediate passes. And now, I don't know if y'all have heard of Deion Sanders. He is currently the head coach of the University of Colorado football team. He also does a lot of commercials. I think DirecTV might have been a recent one. He does do a lot of Aflac commercials with Nick Saban. And now I would like to note, we are approximately 31 minutes into the talk, and I am now mentioning that I went to the University of Alabama, and I love the Crimson Tide football team. So if anyone's familiar with Alabama fans, I would like to say, pretty impressive that I waited this long to let you know. Roll Tide! And so Nick Saban was our former head coach, especially while I was there. So with that, what kind of tools are kind of protecting the intermediate areas? We have a web application firewall, otherwise known as a WAF. And if you're familiar with a WAF, it's really good at blocking common attacks. But it does this right outside of the application. So it's on top of the application, it's not within. And so I'm going to go into a few different things where the WAF is great, good, and not as good. So it gives us some great visibility into the threat landscape. It really helps us find suspicious payloads. It's good at DDoS protection, or distributed denial of service, because it helps give visibility into inbound traffic, and it sees how many requests are being made. And it can also help rate limit if needed. But what WAFs are not as good at is exploit prevention. They have no special insight into the application. They have no context unless you configure it, because they can maybe see the traces, but not as clearly as if they were inside the application. So think on that. I promise I'll touch on it in a few. So our last player that we've got our safety. And they are covering and protecting the deep part of the field. So with this, they're trying to disrupt the pass. I can almost assume or almost guarantee that the picture that I showed you before of someone running, trying to tackle the person who caught the ball, I can almost assume that's a safety. But they're trying to disrupt the pass, whether they're trying to bat the ball down, whether they're trying to intercept it or catch it, or whether they're just trying to tackle the player. And now Ed Reed is a brilliant safety. Again, another Baltimore Raven. Sorry about it. But he used to play Tom Brady a lot. And Tom Brady always used to have, when he played the Ravens, on his little play call sheet, he would say, watch for 20. Find 20 before you throw it every time. Ed Reed's number was 20. Ed Reed could see the field, and he was known for intercepting the ball. And so Tom Brady always made it a point to find Ed Reed first. So with this, we have our runtime application self-protection. And this is doing something similar as the WAF, but it's within the application. So all the requests go through the server and then hit the RASP. And so it's trying to prevent these exploits, but it has context. So with that, it's trying to monitor and block exploits within the application. So I'll give you a bit about the bad, good, and great that a RASP is. A RASP is not great at blocking DDoS attacks because it's in the app. All the hundreds of thousands of requests that a DDoS attack is trying to make, it's already gone through the server at this point. So not as good there. It does have good visibility into the threat landscape, and this is improved over a traditional WAF. But where the RASP tools really thrive is exploit prevention, because it's trying to look at the trace and it's able to see the trace and gain extra visibility to identify whether an attack is happening. And because it can see exactly what's being called, and then it's able to generally use pattern matching to identify different attacks. Okay, now I know this is a cliche, but there is no I in team. Not one position can cover all areas of the field, just like not one security tool can cover every aspect of application security. So we have to work together. We need teamwork. So first, not every player needs to be used in every situation. But you still want them on the field, right? Because imagine if we said, oh, we think the offense is going to run the ball right now, so we're going to put our defensive line out there, but everyone else can take a break, take a breather. Well, what happens if the run play gets through the defensive line? Where are other layers of protection? Also, what happens if they don't run? What happens if they throw the ball? No offense, but I mentioned our defensive line. They're the biggest guys out there. They're generally not the fastest. They're not going to be able to run and try to catch the player who just caught the ball. So with that, prevention eventually fails. Why not have defense in depth? But again, not all of your security tools would be needed every day in every situation. But you want to make sure they're in place in case something does happen, because they all excel at different things. And now we also want to make sure we're communicating. You can always see players on the field pointing to each other, calling out different things that might happen. Well, we want to do that in security as well. We want to make sure everyone knows what their job is. Who's supposed to fix what types of vulnerabilities? If we're seeing an attack, who's in charge of alerting people? Who's in charge of creating an incident? And then lastly, we want to continue to adapt. And now football players, they have a halftime in the game after the first 30 minutes. And at that halftime, they can make mid-game adjustments, but they can also make adjustments throughout the season. This is true for security. In the middle of an attack, we can make adjustments. We can fine-tune our RASP or our WAF, or we can say, oh, this process needs to change. But we can also do that when we're not in the middle of an attack, while we're just during a maintenance phase. So we can do it at both times, just like football. So now I'm going to give y'all just a very brief example. Let's look at a JavaScript website in production. And now this JavaScript website has a front end, a back end, and an API. And with that, I want some different tools in place. I want SCA scans because I hear JavaScript, immediately I think of the hundreds of thousands, if not more, of dependencies that JavaScript has. So I want those dependency scans. I also want the interactive application security testing scans because we're in production. We've got running code. We want that runtime context. And then next, assuming that I don't have an unlimited budget, which is unfortunate, but you know, gotta deal with, I want a combination of penetration testing and DAST scans. I want to make sure that I'm able to have some of that brain power, that human-powered pen testing that goes on with their trying to find the complex vulnerabilities, but I also know maybe I'll supplement it with some DAST scans. And then lastly, I want a RASP on this application. I'm not seeing a lot of DDoS attacks. That's not something that has been occurring. I think a RASP will work better in this place. And I'm just going to give y'all a tip. For faster feedback, add all these scans to the pull requests or the CI/CD pipeline. But I'm going to give you another tip. If you want even more feedback sooner, there are so many IDE and CLI scans out there, whether they're open source or paid, where you can get feedback immediately then as you're developing. So let's think about practice and prep. We need to create a playbook. We need to know what we'll do if something happens. And just as we want to create a playbook, football, obviously, teams have their playbook, and they adjust it all the time as well. With that, we want to watch film. And we can do this in a few ways. Obviously, threat modeling, as I mentioned earlier, but let's take it a step further. Let's do some security research. Let's look into our OWASP top 10. Or let's look at purposely vulnerable apps used for testing. And now I created an open source repo. It's called Application Security Reference Examples, where I have stood up a purposely vulnerable website. And I've done this because I want to see how our tools at Datadog react to it. So everything is stood up at once, and I want to see how our tools react so I know what to expect. And then I can practice fixing the vulnerabilities and blocking the vulnerabilities and adjusting the RASP. And there's also so many sites out there that can be used. The DVWA, the DVNA, anything along those lines. I think OWASP has a juice shop website. There's so many resources. But then we also want to walk through our plan. It's not enough just to know it's there. We need to make sure we at least have an understanding of how it's going to work. And with football players, the day before the game, they go and walk through every one of the plays they're hoping to run. We should be doing that in security as well, walking through to make sure we know the procedures and what we need to do when an attack is happening. And then lastly, we need to learn from our past mistakes. Now, again, if you are a football fan, you might know that the Eagles just beat the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. What you also might know is 2 years ago, the Eagles played the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. And their quarterback, Jalen Hurts, he had one of his best games 2 years ago in that Super Bowl. And they still lost because nothing's for certain. And that's kind of true for security. Nothing's 100% secure. But they came back and they played the Chiefs again this year. And they won by a significant amount. And in all the press and all the interviews that Jalen Hurts did after, there were two things that stood out to me. First, he said, defense wins championships. Okay, pretty cool. But he was also focused on the fact that they were able to learn from the past. They were able to learn from past mistakes that happened 2 Super Bowls prior, but also in all the games in between, and they were able to learn from that to do better. And so we want to take the time to reflect on what went wrong. Why was something vulnerable? What was the breakdown in the process? And a lot of times in tech, this is called a retrospective or a retro. So I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with this, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. But normally we ask 4 questions during a retro. What went wrong? What challenges did we face? What could be improved for next time? And what lessons did we learn? So we want to be thinking about this as we are going through anything, but specifically security. So I just want to bring it back to the beginning. As we can see, we want to have different layers in place because each layer has a different responsibility. Each tool has a different purpose. And one tool can't cover the entire application security realm, just like one football player can't cover the entire field. And even if you were one of the people who said, no, you're not a football fan, my hope is that this talk made security and defense in depth a little more understandable, and relatable, but also that if you have someone back at work or one of your friends who loves football, and if you think they might enjoy this, you know, you can bring the idea back to them and say, hey, this was cool. But we do have a security newsletter at Datadog. This is a free newsletter that my team puts together once a month. We do rotate who does it so that we have a different perspective each time. This compiles resource that our security research team has put together, but also we add resources and research from outside of Datadog. So I did want to share this in case you're interested. But with that, I want to open it up to any questions. Yes.
Where would you put threat hunters in your analogy?
That's a great question. So by threat hunters, do you mean like red team?
They're usually part of the red team.
Okay.
Like the folks that are going through digging logs, looking for indicators of compromise that haven't been detected. They're usually doing it based on a hypothesis. We think we've been breached in this way because it's a likely attack vector, but none of our tools have caught it yet. And they're going to develop the specific detection mechanisms that are going to then be used to hopefully automate them. CrowdStrike's Overwatch is a good example. Their Overwatch Elite are their top guys that do that as well. So that's an example. Sometimes you've got an in-house team.
Yes. So honestly, it doesn't really fit with the analogy. But I say that in the way as these are all, for the most part, preventative measures. These all happen before an attack or try to block an attack. That's very much like the investigative side. I almost want to say like referees, because they are trying to look at all the rules and stuff, but refs don't always get the best rep. So I know. So that's kind of where I put them. Yeah. Cool. Oh.
Thanks for the talk, first thing first. I mean, when you're giving your talk, you said that pen test is expensive. And I just want to ask your opinion as a pen tester that what about being compromised? I think being compromised is more expensive. And, and I'm just wondering, what are you thinking? Because as far as I observation, yes, pen testing is something, it's not cheap, I would say. But once again, being compromised is something else than the just spending your money.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be honest. Most security tools are expensive. Pen testing just happens to be the most expensive. However, like you said, breaches are always going to be even more expensive, which is why we can normally add security tools into budgets. And that is one of the hardest things as someone who helped my former CISO help create the budget and help try to get tools. It's really hard to show that these tools are working if no breaches have happened. And so that's very much something that's constantly brought up, especially at the CISO and the head of security level, trying to get budget for these tools, because you're right, these tools are expensive. But what happens if you're breached? What happens if there's a ransomware attack and you have to pay all this money? Now, you might have ransomware insurance, you might have cybersecurity insurance, but you're still paying money at some point. So I will always say, I want more security tools than less security tools. I would always say, I want pen tests more often than less often. But I do understand that's not feasible in everyone's budget, and in everyone's kind of security plan. Yes?
On that last note about it's hard to prove a negative, like the tiger repellent, right? What are some of the KPIs that your CISOs have used in order to validate that they're doing a good job? And yeah, we haven't been breached, but we're still asking for more money to accomplish this. Can you give some examples?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question. How do you prove a negative? Like, how do you prove that your work prevented something from happening? And what kind of KPIs have I used? It all depends, and it depends on what your team is focused on and also what the overall kind of company structure is. Previously, I was at an app development company that was more consulting. So we would write code for clients. So we were able to track vulnerabilities. What vulnerabilities are we seeing? What were we able to fix? And then in what time period? And tracking to see, are we consistently keeping our vulnerability totals low? That was one of the ways where we can't prove that doing this prevented a breach, because there's not always a way to prove that. But by being able to show, hey, we were able to get the vulnerabilities from this amount to this amount, shows that we've lowered the risk. And I think the biggest thing is to try to show risk. And if you don't fix things, or if you don't have certain tools, your risk is higher. And how much risk do you want to accept? And then from there, you also need buy-in. You need security buy-in from your leadership. Because if the CEO, if the CTO, if they don't think security is necessary, it's very hard for you to get the budget for it. So you really need buy-in from all the members of the C-suite or whoever oversees the security and the technology aspects of the company, because without that buy-in, they might not care about the risk. Yes.
Question then, how do you take that answer and apply it to your analogy?
Well, I think the analogy, the defense in depth, all the different layers, that's kind of a good way to show maybe a CEO who isn't as technical, who doesn't always understand, well, why do we need all these tools? Why can't we just use one? Like, why can't we just check for dependencies? Or let's not even look at vulnerabilities. Let's just put a WAF in place. And I think this is a great way to show, oh, hey, maybe there is a use case to have multiple different tools in place. And whether they're from one product or from one company, one platform, or if they're all open source, because that's an option as well. But I think being able to show there is a purpose for each type of tool and for each layer can hopefully help them better understand. Yes?
It's not really in your slides, but I wanted to know how are you handling vulnerability management right now on your software? Do you just look at the CVSS score, or are you looking into the reachability index, because the CVSS score may not be what I call 100%. I mean, you really need to know whether it's reachable or not, right? So are you, I just want to hear what do you guys do at Datadog in terms of, because you can't fix everything, let's just put it out there, right? You have to pick it, you have to set a priority. So I wanted to hear about what you say in terms of, do you just rely on CVSS score to, that's how you say, okay, this is the critical ones, I'm gonna fix all this, and maybe fix the medium one, I don't know, I want to hear your opinion about that. Because I'm struggling with a vulnerability management plan, and I don't know if we're really doing we're spending a lot of time on it, but I'm not sure really, are we really spending the right time on the right things? And reachability index has been discussed a lot recently, so I wanted to hear your opinion about it.
Yes, so while I do work at Datadog, this is in no way a sales pitch, so I don't want to focus too much on that, but I will tell you how I have approached it before, and then I will also tell you Datadog's approach. So I think for me, finding what's in production versus what is a dev dependency. Again, I'm assuming a lot of your vulnerabilities are coming from dependencies, which might not be the case. But specifically, can we easily identify what's in production versus what's a dev dependency? Which I know JavaScript has a way to identify, so do some other languages. But I also think we need to find easy wins, because sometimes having all the vulnerabilities, having hundreds, it's overwhelming for everyone. So even if they're not the biggest wins, being able to identify some easy wins, make it feel like you're working towards something, and it helps first to start get the numbers down, but also it shows progress, which I think a lot of times it's hard to see progress. So I think specifically, and it depends what kind of tools you have at your availability, but at Datadog, so we take the CVSS score, but then we also combine it with the reachability because it has the runtime context. It knows whether it's in production or whether it's in staging, but then also whether it's being actively exploited. If we're seeing a certain area has been actively exploited recently, or if a specific vulnerability has been actively exploited, and if you, again, with or without Datadog, have that knowledge, I would start fixing that first. And so we are able to adjust that CVSS score based whether it's in production or not, whether it's being actively exploited or not. Yeah.
That's great. I actually am happy to what I'm hearing, because you're using not just purely the CVSS score, but you're looking at the exploitability and reachability index. But I do have another question. So when you look at whether it can be exploited, are you looking to a specific industry for your client? Because every industry has a different, like certain, nation state threat actor use certain MITRE attack framework. And so I'm just curious, because I haven't really seen anything that's specifically talk about, let's just say, healthcare industry, aerospace industry. So I'd like to hear, what is your experience on that? In addition to what you just said, those are good, but I'm drilling down into deeper, because we cannot fix everything. Let's just put it this way. And the software keep on changing, we got more dependencies, all that. You know what I'm talking about. So anything about the specific industry that you can talk about, whether you're planning to do it or maybe that's just out of scope because it's too hard to manage anyway?
Well, I can tell you that Datadog, the way we can show that an exploit has been happening is because we're able to look at all the traces of the application. So it's specifically tailored to that application. But within the industry, I think I don't know if there are any metrics out there, but generally, and I'm sure there are, but you need to know what your industry is. Again, if I'm not in the defense sector, but if I was working more on government things, I tend to know what they're trying to do and where, I think, what keeps you up at night, what is the scariest part about your application? What kind of sensitive data? Do you have sensitive data? Is it more you just have a login, like authentication page? Are you keeping track, or are you controlling PCI and PII data? So I think it very much has to be tailored to more exactly what you're doing compared to industry. However, I do think there are definitely some industries that lean more towards different attacks. Yes.
So to identify which industries have different threats, there are reports that are published. These are retrospectives, so like CrowdStrike and Verizon, they're talking about these particular threat actors are targeting these sorts of industries in these ways. So those are usually freely available. But then also there's threat intelligence feeds that you can use, integrate with your tools, and that'll tell you what are the trends, what are the bad guys up to right now, what's their popular place to attack, what are the vulnerabilities that are being exploited in the wild now, and then you can use that to drill down on your list of vulnerabilities that you've found in your environment. And when you've got a laundry list of things that's way too big, you can use that intelligence feed information to determine, okay, so the bad guys are hitting this one that we have that's critical, it's production facing, the reachability index, all of that, and it's being exploited now. So you can add that as another one of your criteria to prioritize.
Mhm.
It's not a question, but maybe to add on top of that, I really don't know whether is there any specific metric to distinguish or prioritize rather than the CVSS, but as far as my observation, the peoples are define or set these metrics based on the industry. For example, I had the chance to work with the biomedical, banking, and the, let's say, oil and gas industries. For example, for one vulnerability, let's say the SSRF is super crucial for the banking industry, but it's not even info severity for the oil and gas industry. I mean, it really depends on the business objectives and the business goals. So I think you need to define which one is so important and which one is not. Yeah.
Mhm.
And even sometimes the same vulnerability can be different than the two different applications. For example, if you have one application which is mission critical for the company, it really depends on the.
Further more questions?
Yeah. Of course. It seems like we have a few more questions. I know we are at time if y'all need to get to anywhere else, but I'm happy to stay and answer the last few questions for y'all.
So I have a question about phishing attacks, especially this day and age where AI is more prevalent, and I hear that AI is being used, especially voice generation software and phone calls as phishing attacks. How do you protect against those, especially in a company, for example?
So just to clarify, your question is how do we protect against like voice attacks happening?
Yeah, voice and email attacks, which are more like advanced nowadays with the uses of AI and like scam calls essentially. In like ransomware attacks, for example, where they just want to lock your computer, for example.
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest, that is a whole nother realm of security depending on what you're focusing on. And I'm gonna be honest, I tend to stay within the world of AppSec, and that's a little more kind of internal security. But I think it's kind of twofold. I think trying to teach people to stay smart about what information they're giving out, who they answer the phone to, and I think just taking a breather before they answer a call or give out information or click on a link, just being able to take a breath and think about it. However, I don't know if I'm the best one to really anticipate and be able to answer that question.
I'm a DevOps engineer who was just thrust onto the security team with no training or anything whatsoever. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for this incredibly beautifully structured talk. My brain loves the like, this corresponds to this. And it's just given me a whole framework now where I feel like I can actually sit down and learn things instead of just flailing about. And we use Datadog for security monitoring, so it was just absolutely perfect. And I just want to say how grateful I am that you gave this talk and structured it the way that you did.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you. Looks like we got one more question.
That was a great talk. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Just for the audience, I'm the founder of Icosic AI. We let you search through all of your server logs using conversation. You can investigate security incidents in seconds rather than hours, saving you time and money. If you're interested in learning more, catch me afterwards. I'm here for 5 minutes. Thanks.
Cool. Last question. Yeah.
So this is actually just kind of an attempt at an answer to the previous question. So the voice and the phishing attacks, you mentioned make sure people are trained. Security 101 is making sure that you have a security awareness campaign that's running. KnowBe4 is a great platform to use for that. There are plenty of others out there, but there's lots of resources to make sure that your users are trained up for your organization. And then kind of the goal of a lot of the phishing and the voice stuff is to gain access to financial resources, right? Passwords and whatnot. So as part of that security awareness campaign, making sure that people are trained on appropriate processes and procedures for your organization is a good way to go. And this last piece, as far as like AI voice attacks and stuff that are happening now, I don't know about this in the context of organizational security, but in terms of personal security, we should all, for our family members, have a safe word that we use, that we never send anywhere, that we never publish anywhere, that we never send in text or email or anything like that, that's only communicated face to face, so that it can never have been lifted from anywhere. And that way, if you're like, you get the call that your wife's been kidnapped and you've got to wire $50,000, if the safe word isn't present or whatever your process is, then it's a scam, right? Because you're going to be too freaked out if you can't get a hold of your wife and they're saying they've got her and you hear her voice or whatever. So these are attacks that are happening now. So have a live safe word that can't be lifted off of the internet in any way. So.
Awesome. Well, I do want to say thank y'all. Feel free to connect with me and ask any questions after this if y'all have any additional ones. Have a great keynote and the rest of your day.